this guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hi there, welcome to Brazier from 4 until 6 in the next hour for you as Boris Johnson starts his final week in number 10. Why is he taking such a strong stance on the UK sticking to its net zero, the target there, despite households seeing their energy bills soar? Is the outgoing Prime Minister right to push his 2050 net zero target onto the country as he prepares to walk away? Also, should all police officers in the UK carry tasers? The first Chief Constable to arm all of his officers with the devices has called for all forces in the country to do the same. He is Nick Adderley. He says it could be a life-saving piece of equipment for his officers. We'll ask whether other forces should be following suit. There was almost liftoff for a new era of space exploration and the journey to send man back to the moon today. Man and woman, it ought to be said. NASA cancelled the planned launch of Artemis 1 earlier after technical difficulties. The mission, a test run for a future attempt to send humans back to the moon, will now lift off on Friday. With me for the next 2 hours and keeping us both safely on Earth, senior GB News contributor Tim Montgomery. But first, the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. Good afternoon. Well, as you've just been hearing, NASA has postponed the launch of its new moon rocket over an issue with one of its engines. The uncrewed rocket is the world's most powerful to date and was due to propel a test capsule called Orion far from Earth into the moon's orbit. But engineers are saying an engine bleed that couldn't be remedied is the cause of the launch being called off today. They added the first opportunity for the next launch attempt will be this Friday, depending on how the engine bleed develops. The Artemis 1 mission is aiming to prove people can go to the moon for longer and more sustainably than ever before. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson emphasised the need, though, for safety checks.
It's just illustrative that this is a very complicated machine, a very complicated system, and all those things have to work. And you don't want to light the candle until it's ready to go.
Well, here in the final week of campaigning in the Conservative leadership contest, Liz Truss's team says she favours targeted support to ease the cost of living crisis. However, the Tory leadership candidate says she's not ruling anything out. Ms Truss also says it wouldn't be right to announce her entire plan before she's seen full analysis from Whitehall. Global Chief Executive of market research company Ipsos, Ben Page, says the Foreign Secretary is under pressure.
Public now wants to see more action and more spending. She's slightly against the grain of the things that she says she stands for, but she's probably going to be forced to do it when she turns her attention from the small number of people who are, of course, choosing the leader of the Conservative Party to the electorate as a whole.
Well, Environment Minister and Team Rishi supporter Victoria Prentice told us the former Chancellor believes help should go to those who need it most.
Rishi's plan is very much to target that help at the most vulnerable households. So, for example, pensioner households or people with disabilities or households on the lowest incomes. And I think that's the right way to go. I know this is hard for everybody, but for some people it's really hard and we need to help them get through it.
Turning attentions to Ukraine now, and residents living near Europe's biggest nuclear facility in the country are being given iodine tablets amid fears of a nuclear incident. The authorities handed out the medication to parents and children living close to the Zaporizhzhia power station amid intense fighting. That's as a team from the International Atomic Energy Agency gets on its way to investigate a Russian-occupied facility, saying its safety and security must be protected. Here, the Prince of Wales will make a donation to aid charity Islamic Relief to help those affected by the floods in Pakistan. It follows a message from Her Majesty the Queen to the President of Pakistan saying she's deeply saddened by the tragic loss of life and destruction in the country. Pakistan itself is appealing for international support as more than 1,000 people have lost their lives. Unusually heavy monsoon rains have caused floods in both the north and the south of the country, destroying farmland, crops and impacting more than 30 million people. The country's foreign minister is requesting financial help and aid from the United Nations member states.
They're absolutely devastating. I haven't seen any destruction or devastation of this scale. I find it very difficult to put into words. The phraseologies that we're used to, whether it's monsoon rains or flooding, doesn't quite seem to encapsulate the ongoing devastation and disaster that we're still witnessing.
Britain's biggest warship has suffered a mechanical issue shortly after leaving the south coast. HMS Prince of Wales left Portsmouth on Saturday to spend the next 3 months working with US military partners in the Atlantic. Well, she's now anchored off the Isle of Wight and divers have been seen underneath the ship following concerns about damage to a propeller. Good news for the government of Gibraltar. The government has confirmed here that Gibraltar's status as a city, more than 180 years after it was first bestowed by Queen Victoria, stands. The title was originally awarded in 1842, but it was then left off the official list of recognised cities. Now, a newly published record confirms Gibraltar's inclusion as a city. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson describes the decision as a huge accolade to its rich history and dynamism. That's it. You're up to date on GB News. More news as it happens. Now back to Brazier.
Hi there and a very good afternoon to you. It is 7 minutes past 4. The outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson will this week urge Britain not to give up on net zero. In a farewell message, he'll say the UK can pursue the policy, despite suggestions from many of his own MPs that it's contributed to skyrocketing energy bills. Liz Truss, yes, the bookie's favourite to be the next Prime Minister, said she would suspend green levies on energy bills and has insisted that the government's 2050 net zero target must not, quote, harm businesses or consumers. Let's turn to the director of Net Zero Watch, Benny Pizer. Benny, welcome to you. I just wonder to what extent you feel Boris Johnson owns this idea of net zero by 2050. After all, it was his predecessor, Theresa May, who enshrined it in law.
Yeah, it would be nice to think it's just Boris Johnson's pet idea. I'm afraid it is an all-party consensus, and that makes it so difficult for anyone to acknowledge that it is adding significantly to the energy cost crisis. I'm afraid the next Prime Minister will almost be paralyzed as a result of this obsession with net zero.
But to be clear, I mean, we're not suggesting, are we, that anything other than the crisis in Ukraine is the principal source of our current woes over energy costs?
No. The war in Ukraine is just accelerating a upward trend that happened much earlier, much before this crisis in the Ukraine. The reason is that in contrast to previous energy crises where we would be able to diversify, Britain and much of Europe is no longer able to diversify energy resources. We've closed down most coal power plants, or blown them up, so we can't go back to them. The only energy that we are using to back up renewables is gas, and that is happening all over Europe. And that has driven up the demand for gas. Had we still got plenty of coal power plants, we could diversify like other countries, like the US, and we would not be in this situation. And the more renewables we are building, like Boris is proposing, the more we will be depending on natural gas.
They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, don't they? As you were talking there, Benny, we were just using pictures, and apologies if anybody's listening on the radio, using pictures of e-charging points, electric charging points for cars. And we read stories at the moment, don't we, about how it's becoming difficult. It's become so much more expensive to recharge your electric car. Who would have thunk it?
Yes. Yeah, I read that nowadays it's more expensive to drive an electric car than a normal petrol car. And that is only going to get worse as electricity prices go up. So I'm afraid the Conservative government is deeply divided on net zero. Boris clearly prioritizes green issues over everything else. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the terrible situation. He's still not acknowledging that you have to look after your national security or economic security or stability. That all comes second or third over his green agenda. So the next prime minister will face not just Boris Johnson, but people like Zach Goldsmith, who've made public that they would rather support Labour than a prime minister who would water down some of the very costly net zero policies.
Benny, just something to just amplify a point you made a moment ago, and I don't doubt it's true. In fact, I seem to remember images suggesting it is true, but you were saying that power stations have been blown up lest we start to backslide.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in contrast to other European countries like Germany, which are going back to old mothballed coal power plants, they still exist. You can still reopen them, or nuclear power plants. In Britain, that is no longer possible. You've either flooded coal mines or blown up coal power plants, so we're completely and utterly dependent on natural gas because there are no alternatives, certainly not in the short term. And that makes the crisis even worse. So we will face a horrendous winter, and unless the government actually introduces radical reforms, this horrendous winter will go on for the next 1 or 2 or 3 years.
Benny Pizer is the director of Net Zero Watch. Benny, appreciate your time, if not your warnings. Thanks very much indeed. Tim Montgomery is with me for the next couple of hours, GB News senior contributor and a former advisor to Boris Johnson. Is he a believer? He is a believer, obviously, in net zero.
He is, and his wife certainly is as well. I think there may be a little bit of domestic pressure on him in this issue, if I'm allowed to say that. But Benny's completely right. You look at the Twitter timeline of Alok Sharma, who is the Prime Minister's representative at the COP summit in Glasgow, and he was recently celebrating blowing up one of Britain's last coal-fired power stations. And it's one of the reasons why I don't actually regret the fall of Boris Johnson, because it's almost, climate change has almost become religious for him. And fair enough, we should diversify our power supply. We should invest in renewables, but we should have had a backup plan. We should have had more diverse energy supply for exactly the kind of circumstances that we now face. And we haven't got those coal-fired power stations existing in sufficient number in Britain now in order for us to have that emergency resort that the current circumstances in Ukraine demand. It's a terrible error of public policy.
And just as an error of presentation, I would say as well, just on the point about blowing things up with a great hue and cry and song and dance, I think back to Nimrod. Remember the Nimrod reconnaissance planes? And the government said, we don't need them anymore. We're going to cut the defence budget. So they literally chopped them up and then found a few months later we could really have done with them. It's a mistake. And we like to lampoon the Germans for the way they did it with their nuclear programme, their nuclear energy programme. But boy, it turned out they needed that too. But instead they've been too busy closing them down.
I think if I was to set up a political party today, it probably wouldn't be the fanciest of names, but I'd call it the long-term party, almost, because it's a crisis in our country, really. We take decisions, particularly presentational positions of the kind you've just been talking about, Colin, for the short term and the media hit. And we've got to start thinking, and this is my hope for Liz Truss, I don't know whether it's a hope based in much reality, but we've got to start thinking much more for the long term, for surprise events. And there's no area of public policy which needs more long-term thinking and planning, cross-party consensus even, than energy.
No, it's been sadly missing. Tim, thanks very much indeed. Every police officer in the UK should be armed with a 50,000-volt stun gun as a matter of routine. So says the Chief Constable of Northamptonshire Police, Nick Adderley. I'm not sure that's him pictured there. That's not him, no. Just for the avoidance of doubt. Who was the first in the UK to arm all his frontline officers with a taser. He said an increase in street violence made the equipment a necessity and that he would be, quote, bordering on neglectful if he'd not handed tasers to each and every one of his frontline officers. Delighted to say we're joined by the former Detective Superintendent at the Met, Shabnam Chowdhury. Shabnam, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Nothing.
Would you rather have had? Did you have a taser?
I didn't have a taser. And
was that because you were too high up the food chain by the time?
by that time,
Yeah.
yes. And I wouldn't have been able to carry one anyway for the simple fact that I wasn't in the front line duties and so on.
Yeah.
But I was given CS spray back in the early stages of my policing career. And even then, I wasn't particularly wanting to carry them because I think it's a huge responsibility to be able to carry something that can, in fact, be quite lethal.
It's a huge responsibility stepping out onto the streets of Northamptonshire or in your case, London, coming up against people who are armed, not just with knives necessarily, but firearms too, and having nothing better on you than a good old-fashioned truncheon, for heaven's sake. Those days are gone.
No, absolutely right, because people do carry weapons, knives, firearms have increased in recent months. So I absolutely support what Nick Adderley is saying. However, what I would say is this, it's not a question of arming every single one of your officers. I think they need to be given the option because there are many police officers that go into policing, not necessarily because they have the ability to carry a taser, but because they have other really good quality skills. Now, in order to use a taser and to be effective, the first thing you need to think about is conflict management. And that means having the art of communication and be able to de-escalate a situation before you actually get to use that taser.
It sounds like what you're heading towards, Shannon, is saying that sometimes a taser can be used by officers who don't want to go through the long, drawn-out process of dealing with things and dealing with a problem and a problem individual in a better way.
Well, look, our police officers are put into very difficult situations. They've got to make very quick, on-the-spur decisions. Police officers are getting younger. They don't necessarily have the ability to think immediately that, actually, I don't need to use this taser. I could have a conversation, first of all. They're not there to be used so that you can just, use them for compliance, for example. They are there for protection of the public, for protection of the police, and protection of the individual who is potentially going to be subjected to that taser.
I always think it's useful to remind people, and I'm sure you always remind people, that our police officers are not some sort of separate breed. They are drawn from the ranks of society, aren't they? And as such, they will have the same, to some degree, same proportion of characteristics that we have in society at large. So there will be, presumably, some police officers who will be a little bit gung-ho. Could you, when you look back at your policing career, particularly when you're on the front line, could you see officers you wouldn't be entirely comfortable
100%. 100%, and without being disrespectful, there's some that I wouldn't necessarily trust with a pen, let alone with a taser. So, but it's important to note that it's not that they haven't got the ability to police at the streets. It's just that they may not have the ability or the mind sense or the presence of mind to be able to decide when that taser is actually got to be discharged. You've got to remember the use of taser can be fatal. We've got recent incidents in the last few months, which we can't really talk about because they're subject to investigation, but we had a 93-year-old in a care home who was tasered, who 3 weeks later died. We had a gentleman that entered the river at Chelsea Bridge, having been tasered. Unfortunately, he also died, and there's been other incidents. So it's a huge amount of risk. The first risk for police officers is public safety, the safety of the individual, the safety of the perpetrator, and the safety of the police officer. So I understand why officers should carry them.
You didn't put the safety of the perp above the safety of the police officer there, did you? That was just how you...
Everybody's safety counts. When you go in as a police officer, you're not sitting there thinking, I've got to save myself or the perpetrator. You're thinking, I have got to save and I've got to be able to protect the public from their own selves, but also to protect other members of the public.
Tim, come on this. Do you have any thoughts on the rollout of tasers?
A lot of wisdom there, but I think if I was a police officer, I think it's a source of pride for our country that our police aren't armed. I think for me, the balance... I think I would like a taser gun on my holster as a last...
I don't like calling them guns.
No, a taser...
but they are...
Well, as a last resort. And I think, for me, the emphasis should be on the training the police officers to absolutely use all those communication skills, etc. you said, and that only ever to be there for that panic need at the very end of a period of negotiation or in a crisis situation. But I like what you say about it should be the police officer's choice.
Yeah, I think, there are many police officers that I've spoken to that I know from policing and throughout my career who wouldn't necessarily want to be armed with a taser. But equally, it's firearms and knife crime. There's been increases, so you've got to protect.
Is there not a tactical problem with choice? I know that sounds odd, but if you could imagine a situation, particularly, in one force against another, where a culture has taken root, where a few high-profile, influential frontline officers say, we don't want it. We don't want it, OK? So you end up with officers, large numbers of officers, deploying on the streets, facing dangerous situations where, because they've had the choice, nobody's got the taser. And that taser might be the difference between saving a member of the public's life. But because you've introduced choice, and the officers have chosen, for whatever reason, you haven't trained me enough, you're not paying me enough, or whatever the reason is, leave it to the specialist tactical officers with their actual guns. You've introduced choice, and actually once you've introduced choice, you run the risk of there not being much take-up of the taser.
Well, I think you'll find that most police officers probably want to carry a taser, but there will be those that don't. But you've also got to look at the roles that they're performing. For example, when I was running Romford area, we had town centre teams, and those officers wanted tasers, but they didn't have them because they didn't have the training for them, and we didn't have the finances for them. So we submitted a number of reports to get them armed with tasers, because when they're dealing out on the streets on the nighttime economy, and you've got serious disorder, or you've got antisocial behaviour, or you've got robberies and burglaries or night crime, all that kind of stuff going on, those officers should be carrying a taser. So it may be that a certain union, a particular area of policing, everybody has a taser because they've been trained, because they wanted to carry it, and because it's a role that they wanted to perform. But then if you go into, say, for example, child protection services, safeguarding of children, you go into domestic abuse as criminal investigation departments, you might not necessarily need to carry one. However, if there's a major incident across the whole of London or the UK, then obviously it's going to necessitate as many officers as possible that carry tasers, and that's when I guess you've got to get the balance right.
If anybody was just tuning in, heard that Sharon Chowdhury say she was running Romford. She wasn't a gangster, she was a police officer then. Sharon Chowdhury, really appreciate you coming in and your expertise and your experience. Thanks very much.
Cheers, thank you.
You're with Colin Brazier. This is GBNews on TV, online and on digital radio. Coming up, the UK's biggest aircraft carrier, HMS Prince of Wales, broke down off the south coast at the weekend shortly after steaming off for a landmark mission to the United States. It's not the first time a state-of-the-art warship has encountered problems after leaving Portsmouth Harbour. We will explain. Oh yes, Mary Rose did the same thing, but that was in 1545. How we're going to make that a story, you'll have to hang on, we'll show you. First, we'll have a look at the weather.
Well, looking ahead, and the UK is looking dry for many, although some showers developing across the north and east. Let's take a look at those details. Many northern and eastern parts of Scotland will have a rather cloudy afternoon, where further west we'll see some sunshine. There'll be a few showers developing, especially over the higher ground. Over to Northern Ireland, where we may see the odd shower develop, but most will miss them and have a dry afternoon with some spells of sunshine. Northern England will see a fair amount of cloud this afternoon, but it'll be mostly dry. The best of any sunshine will be along the Irish Sea coasts. Over to Wales, though, which will see brighter skies this afternoon, especially out towards the west. A few showers may develop, but most will be dry, with temperatures reaching the mid-20s in places. The Midlands will see a dry bank holiday afternoon, but there will be a fair bit of cloud around, especially in the east. Despite this, temperatures will reach the low 20s. It may feel a tad cooler than late across East Anglia this afternoon as a keen northeasterly breeze develops. It'll be dry though, although rather cloudy. The east to northeast breeze will also be noticeable along the south coast this afternoon. Many of us, though, will see some sunny spells, especially out towards the west. Cloud will then melt away as we move towards the evening, but some showers will continue in the north. And that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hi there, thanks for your company with Colin Brazier on GB News, on TV and on radio. Many of you are getting in touch by email, your thoughts on Boris Johnson, urging his successor to stick to the government's legally binding net zero pledge. Les says Boris needs to stop listening to his good lady as she is pushing this net zero nonsense. We can't be sure that's what's happening in the Boris household.
Oh, yes, we can.
Says Tim Montgomery, who thinks it might be what's happening. We can't prove it. David says, double down on net zero, push huge initiatives for renewables and make us free of the companies extorting ordinary people. John says, like the disastrous COVID lockdown policy, non-action on the current energy crisis is intentional, as net zero is the policy aim. No doubt in a couple of years, some minister like Sunak will come clean and claim they were all against it all along. And Barbara says, call me sceptical, but Carrie has probably said to Boris, get out there and defend green energy or else. Not sure what the or else entails. Tim Montgomery can stay quiet at this moment. The Prince of Wales broke down shortly after steaming away from the south coast on Saturday. The £3 billion aircraft carrier, a recent history of teething problems. She became stranded in Portsmouth 2 years ago after a serious electrical problem. There were a couple of serious leaks as well. Well, we're going to try and take the long view. Not the first time a state-of-the-art warship has experienced problems after setting off from Portsmouth's naval base in 1545. The Mary Rose, Henry VIII's flagship, famously sank in the Solent after listing heavily following a gust of wind. Actually, I'm not sure. I mean, there isn't a definitive account of how she went down. Her wreckage raised in 1982 and now sits as a fascinating museum exhibit. Let's ponder on this with David Abulafia, Professor of Mediterranean History at the University of Cambridge. Professor, thanks so much for your time. The loss of the Mary Rose, I mean, the Prince of Wales has we presume, a fairly minor mechanical problem, not serious, whereas obviously the Mary Rose was lost, if not with all hands, then most of them. That was a real blow to the military prestige of the country of the day.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's thought that there are about 500 sailors and soldiers on board, and only 35 at most survived. Though compared to the Prince of Wales, I think, has 1,200 crew, which probably includes everything from cooks through to, well, I wouldn't say admirals, but somewhere up the top. So actually the numbers are not that far apart when you think about it. But The interesting thing about you mentioned the sinking of the Mary Rose, and it looks like incompetence. I mean, there are many possible explanations, but it looks as if the gun ports on one side were not closed, and a gust of wind caught the boat shifted, the water started rushing in, and apparently within minutes it was, at the bottom of the sea. The great difference, of course, is that it was a battle. This was a battle, and it was a battle taking place in the Solent. So, really, just off the Isle of Wight. I mean, it was part of this series of wars between Henry VIII and the French, which were all bound up, as you say, with issues of prestige. These two kings who were very similar in character and were always trying to sort of outclass one another.
And we've got to spool forward a couple of hundred years before we begin to see, maybe not quite that far, not least because of our military successes in the Napoleonic Wars led by Horatio Nelson, amongst others. And that became the catalyst, really, for imperial expansion to some degree. From your expertise as Professor of Mediterranean history, the Mediterranean became the sort of naval playground of the Royal Navy.
Yes, indeed. One of the most remarkable things about the history of the Mediterranean in the 18th, 19th centuries is that a country which had no Mediterranean sort of shores of its own, nonetheless created this extraordinarily strong Mediterranean presence. And it wasn't just, you think nowadays about Gibraltar, which is mainly what survives of that, but Minorca, throughout the 18th century, again, there were constant battles between the British and the French to control Minorca. But Minorca was the closest you could get to Toulon in the south of France, which was the Mediterranean base of the French Navy. So you can imagine how upset the French were to see the British so close to Toulon. And then, of course, subsequently, Malta, which was captured from Napoleon. Later on, still, you've got Cyprus. And, we still have that presence. We've got, obviously, Gibraltar. But in Cyprus, there are these two sovereign bases, which are a very important part of the British sort of military network for collecting data about what's going on in the Middle East. So we're still there. And in the 19th century, even more so with the opening of the Suez Canal, which meant that the Mediterranean became the prime route to imperial India. And so it wasn't just valued for itself, it was valued even more as the shortcut to the Indian Ocean and beyond.
David Abulafia is Professor of Mediterranean History at the University of Cambridge. Professor, thanks for your time. Tim Montgomery is alongside me. These big ships are a source of great national prestige. They cost a few bob, too.
They certainly do, and of course, so do the aircraft that we put upon these aircraft carriers. And I remember the controversy that we had when I think the Cameron government first commissioned gave the go-ahead, certainly, for the Queen Elizabeth. We didn't have aircraft for them. This was regarded as sort of, I think, very stupid. But back to the point we were talking about a little bit earlier, Colin, long-termism is what this country needs more of. And actually, we are beginning now to recreate something of the kind of fleet that Britain needs for its defence. And of course, it's a little bit embarrassing that as the HMS Prince of Wales is sailing today, that it's hit this fault. But it's not the only other launch today that hasn't come quite right. And, we just need to invest in a dangerous world in these kind of capacities. And this will be a huge asset, not just to Britain, but to the Western Alliance, I think, in the years to come. Part of a battleship fleet, a ability to project power around the world with our partner nations is a really important contribution to Britain's place in the world.
Tim, thanks very much. You're with Colin Brazier on GB News, on TV, online and on digital radio. Coming up, we'll take a trip to Speaker's Corner. Tim's going to give his take on why he thinks the BBC is failing licence fee payers. We'll also debate whether the Prime Minister will leave Number 10 hero or villain. What do you think? Let us know. First, the latest news with Polly.
Colin, thank you. The top stories this hour. NASA has postponed the launch of its new moon rocket over an issue with one of its engines. The unmanned rocket is the world's most powerful to date and was due to propel a test capsule called Orion far from Earth into the moon's orbit. But engineers say an engine bleed that couldn't be remedied is the cause of the launch being called off today. They added the first opportunity for the next launch attempt will be on September the 2nd, depending how the engine bleed develops. The Artemis 1 mission is aiming to prove people can go to the moon for longer and more sustainably than ever before. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson emphasised the need for safety checks.
It's just illustrative that this is a very complicated machine, a very complicated system, and all those things have to work. And you don't want to light the candle until it's ready to go.
Residents living near Europe's biggest nuclear facility in Ukraine are being given iodine tablets amid fears of a nuclear incident. The authorities handed out the medication to parents and children living close to the Zaporizhzhia power station amid intense fighting there. That's as a team from the International Atomic Energy Agency got on its way to investigate a Russian-occupied facility, saying safety and security in the country must be protected. And as you've been hearing, the Prince of Wales, I'm sorry, I got my stories mixed up there. The Prince of Wales will be making a donation to aid charity Islamic Relief to help those affected by the floods in Pakistan. It follows a message from Her Majesty the Queen to the President of Pakistan saying she's deeply saddened by the tragic loss of life and destruction due to flooding in the country. It follows an appeal by Pakistan for international support as more than 1,000 people have been killed. Unusually heavy monsoon rains have caused floods in both the north and the south of the country, destroying farmland, crops and impacting more than 30 million people. And the government has confirmed Gibraltar's status as a city more than 180 years after it was first bestowed even by Queen Victoria. The title was originally awarded in 1842, but it was then left off the official register. Now, a newly published record confirms Gibraltar's inclusion as a fully fledged city. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson describes the decision as a huge accolade to its rich history and its dynamism. That's it. You're up to date on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News and Colin Brazier's back in just a bit.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Time for today's visit to Speaker's Corner. It's the part of the show where we let our studio guests get their views off their chests about a topic about which they are passionate. Today it's the turn of senior GB News contributor Tim Montgomery. For the next 2 minutes or so, Tim, the show is yours.
I tried to steal some spaghetti the other day, but the supermarket security guard saw me and I couldn't get past her. That wasn't my favourite joke from the Edinburgh Festival, though. Emily Maitlis provided that. The BBC is biased towards Brexit. Towards Brexit. Ho, ho, ho. If the former anchor of BBC's Newsnight could tear herself away from The Guardian's media pages for 5 minutes, I'm willing to debate her in any forum of her choosing on BBC bias. And for every single example of a question time panel, any questions panel, Mar panel or Politics Live panel that Emily Maitlis could mention that contained a majority of Brexiteers, I'll name 10 that were dominated by Remainers. In the unlikely event that Ms Maitlis agrees to debate, she'd at least be braver than the average BBC editor or producer. Roger Bolton, who's just been forced out of his position as champion of Radio 4 listeners, has complained that most of the people responsible for creating the content that all licence fee payers are forced to pay for refuse to come on to his feedback programme to answer questions and criticisms. Last week, Liz Truss was unfair in saying that the BBC didn't get its facts right. All of my experience of our national broadcaster suggests that actually they are very thorough about accuracy. It's one of its many strengths. But fake news takes many forms, and news is fake, still fake, if it gives consistently lopsided accounts of the world in which we live. And in my eyes, the BBC is guilty of that. Why, for example, does the BBC give ever more space to covering racism when racism is declining, but ever less space to family breakdown when that is growing and causing ever more misery? Why? When Liz Truss makes a joke about the French president, is it a sign of British politicians' immaturity? But zut alors, when Macron attacks Britain, it is also a sign of British politicians' immaturity. At New Broadcasting House, Britain never gets the benefit of the doubt, but Brussels and Paris invariably do. Our nation's public service broadcaster is obsessed with America, but coverage of the rise of China, the #1 story of our age, is infrequent. So let me conclude with one key solution to this BBC problem. After a round of recent appearances on local radio, I was asked to fill in this form. What was my ethnicity? Was I non-binary? You know the rest of the kind of thing they asked. Nothing on whether I was state educated, whether I was religious, whether I was a parent, if I lived inside or outside of London. Until the BBC pursues real diversity, diverse diversity, if you like, it will be a public service broadcaster that only services some of the public. The BBC can choose to change, or more people will choose to switch off.
Well, I agreed with every word. Maybe you did or didn't. Let us know what you think. But we do have a response from Radio 4 directly criticised there, if that's the right word, from Tim. A spokesman for Radio 4 said, feedback has an impressive track record of holding BBC management, programme makers and presenters to account, and the BBC endeavours to provide the programme with interviewees where possible. We want to thank Roger for being a brilliant presenter. He's been a champion of our listeners. Tim, there was so much there to unpack. There was a lot to agree with. And just on the point, and it sometimes feels like media navel-gazing, but it's terribly important because in what Emily Maitlis had to say, she criticised this idea of one-sidism or one side, t'other-sidism.
Yeah.
In other words, let's get, of 10 economists and only one supports Brexit, we'll just give them parity. So we'll get the person for Brexit, the person against Brexit. The problem with that analysis, which seems reasonable, is it ignores what's really going on and where things really are influenced, which is in story selection.
Yeah,
it's not how you guessed or choose your interviewees. It's the choice of stories that you run in your Today programme running order, Newsnight running order, whatever it is. It's the stories you run.
Completely right. I agree with that. Also, I think, Colin, it's also the choice of the questions you ask your guests. So you can be as tough, if you like, on your Conservative or your Labour interviewee. But if the questions you're always asking them are, why aren't you putting up taxes to pay for X? Or why are you, cutting public services in this way? You can be as hard on your interview, regardless of their political colour. But if the question bias is always from the same worldview, believing that unilateral action on climate change is the right way forward, believing that the state is the best way of solving every problem, believing that basically business is bad. If you believe in all these basic things and your questions reflect that, partly because you're staffed by people who've never worked in business or have the same sort of cultural, philosophical background, then you end up with the sort of biases that my little monologue was complaining about.
It wasn't little, it was quite long, but it was very, it was very ear-catching and spot on in so much of its analysis, and it'll be available on Twitter and elsewhere for those of you who didn't catch the whole thing. Time for our debate this hour. Boris Johnson says Britain will emerge stronger and more prosperous on the other side of the cost of living crisis. He made his assertion in a message to the British people ahead of his final week as Prime Minister. Since announcing his resignation in July, the Prime Minister has continued to show his staunch support for Ukraine, so much so, in fact, that there's been speculation it might form part of a future role for him. We'll talk about what that future role for Boris Johnson might be in just a second. Over the last 4 years, he's made good on the promise to deliver Brexit. I think we can broadly agree on that, can't we? Certainly won a landslide election, led the country through a pandemic and dealt with a war in a way really no other European leader, arguably any leader in the world, did quite so forcibly in Ukraine. He's also faced votes of no confidence and seen an investigation into whether he misled Parliament over parties in Downing Street during lockdown. So just days left for the Johnson premiership. It felt like a right moment to ask, how will he be remembered? We're joined here in the studio. We're making him work for his money today. Senior GBNews contributor Tim Montgomery and Alex Story, who's leader of the Bring Back Boris campaign. I'm guessing it does what it says on the tin. It gathered the signatures of more than 20,000 Conservative Party members who wanted the PM to be on the leadership ballot, which tells you something about the wellspring of support there remains for our soon-to-be former Prime Minister. Alex, to you first then. Write his obituary for us, if you would.
Well, I'm not going to at the moment because we've received notification from Conservative Central Office a couple of days ago that we're only a few hundred votes away from from the target of 10,000. We have to go through all the signatures and make sure that they are from members of the Conservative Party before we send it on. So actually, the 10,000 signatures is quite significant because once that happens, the rules can change. And what we're doing really is by forcing this petition through, we're also changing the narrative slightly. We're seeing more and more MPs and, in fact, cabinet ministers having or showing some kind of public remorse about how Boris was removed from office. So actually, it's really about momentum. We are moving in the right direction. We think there's a good possibility that we will get past the 10,000 threshold. We also think that there's an enormous amount of disquiet in the country. This will be the fourth prime minister we will have had in 6 years, which makes us feel and look very much like a Latin American republic, and with pronunciamientos and that kind of stuff. We need to be very careful about the process of how leaders get elected, the time they get in office. We can't just get rid of people because they're irritating or because people don't quite get what they want from the leader.
Tim, Alex speaks to, I would say, a majority of the correspondents who write to us via email, and it's persistent. It wasn't just a spasm in the days that followed the announcement of his resignation. It certainly seems to me, it will seem to others, that there is a degree of bitterness there, lingering bitterness about the way Boris Johnson was removed.
And I sympathise with that. And I think Alex's point about the number of prime ministers that have been removed from office one way or another between recent elections is a real problem. We have to reflect on that. But as much as I like Alex, I think what he's doing is really undermining the democratic process now. The Conservative Party has gone through official processes. Boris Johnson resigned of his own accord. And what Alex is doing now with this petition and with this campaign is really doing Keir Starmer's work for him. We are undermining, through this campaign to restore Boris, the new Conservative leader, a new Prime Minister. But my main criticism isn't of Alex. I can understand why he's doing what he's doing. My main criticism is of Boris Johnson for failing to, frankly, slap down Alex and other campaigners and say, look, whatever has been is over, and now support my successor and discontinue this campaign.
Because, Alex, if you got your way, how would it look to the public in the midst of this cost of living crisis if the whole, whatever it is, 6-7 week period process in which the process has been to select a new Conservative Party leader and thus Prime Minister had effectively been a waste of time that could have been spent by what's seen by many as a zombie government tackling the real problems the nation faces right now?
That's not an argument for not doing the right thing. I mean, the bottom line is, we know, and you said it in your monologue, that Boris passed a vote of no confidence. The Pincher affair, which actually brought me back into the sphere that I never really wanted to revisit again, and that's UK politics, kind of forced me to take a stance, because the way that Boris was ejected, in my view, was based on a couple of pretexts which actually don't hold any water. And so when you might be saying that I'm doing Keir Starmer's work, the people who did Keir Starmer's work are the people who decided to put pressure on Boris to resign after he had won a vote of no confidence. Having done that, the rules stated that he wouldn't be challenged again for another 12 months. But the guys who were trying to force him out said, we will change the rules. And this is
Alex,
one of the things that I find really disagreeable with the Conservative Party. Don't change the rules.
Boris Johnson voluntarily resigned. He chose to resign. You may be unhappy at the circumstances that maybe led to his resignation, but he wasn't forced out. He resigned of his own volition.
Well, quite. But the point is, he resigned due to an enormous amount of pressure put on him by some of his colleagues, and I think personally they were wrong to put that kind of pressure on him. The thing that I find really disagreeable is the fact that this was one of the guys who has had a character assassination campaign on him for the last 4 to 6 years. In fact, the moment that Leave won, his name became mud in the press. He had been the darling of quite a few of the people I might hang out with in London, in the nice parts of Notting Hill and the like. The moment he sided and Leave won, he became persona non grata, and his character had been systematically attacked. And you know this because you've been quite close to him for much longer than I have. You know him personally, and I don't. But the point really is about democracy and parliamentary democracy and the rule of law, or at least the rules-based system that people can understand. Boris won a vote of no confidence. He was not supposed to be challenged for another 12 months, but people who were disaffected with him decided to say, we will change the rules. If you don't leave, we will change the rules. That's why he resigned. He didn't resign because he wanted to go.
Alex, Tory to Montgomery, we've got to leave it there. We could carry on much longer. Maybe we will on another occasion, but not right now. We're out of space. Thanks very much indeed. Both. To something far simpler now, namely rocket science. And technical problems have scuppered NASA's launch of the first rocket in its Artemis project. It's aiming to send astronauts back to the moon. NASA's most powerful rocket, known rather prosaically as the Space Launch System, set to send the unmanned capsule Orion around the back of the moon, but the launch was postponed until at least Friday after engineers failed to fix an engine bleed. Andy Lown, space expert, joins us this afternoon. Andy, welcome to you. Disappointment today, but it'll be aloft soon enough.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of these launches is test launches like this is to solve problems. And the problem that arose, you're going to love this, it's another model for you. There you go. One of the engines here, all the engines had to be brought to the right temperature for liftoff. And what they do is they bleed hydrogen through them. But one of the engines, it just wasn't reaching the right temperature. And it was a test they couldn't achieve when they had the all-up tests previously because of a hydrogen leak. So this was the first time they could actually do it. And it turns out there was a real problem with that. And of course, you can't take the risk of launching like that. It's just a no-go. You can't do it. So unfortunately, they had to abort it today. And they're going to have to obviously try and solve that problem. They've got a chance perhaps they can get it right for Friday, but that, to be honest, it's up to the engineers now to see how to solve that problem. But that's the whole issue of doing these test launches. It's disappointing, but that's part of the game. People forget that the Saturn V in the 1960s, most of its launches failed dismally before the Apollo 8 mission. I mean, really dismally. And of course, Apollo 8 was a magnificent success, and it worked perfectly after that. You'd learn nothing from success. You only learn from failures.
Andy, I don't know whether we saw the bottom of your model. Could you, if you just hold it up again, I'll see whether it's got the top bit on, which is my very untechnical description of. Oh,
you want to see the top bit?
There, yeah, the top. There you go. And my point is, we've gone back to the future, haven't we? In the sense that all that stuff, the escape rocket for the crew capsule and the service module beneath that. I'm sure you could unscrew it and show us it. There you go. It's just what we had 50 years ago, Andy. It feels like we haven't really moved on, even to the point the crew capsule, which you're handling now, the tiles, the ablative tiles they've put for re-entry, they've gone back to the ones they used for Apollo. I'm slightly depressed by this. It doesn't feel like cutting-edge thinking.
It's all about practicality. In engineering, you've got to be pragmatic, and the space shuttle is not really the suitable sort of design to fly to the moon. This is a more practical, suitable design. You've got to design something which is really suitable for it, and one design doesn't fit everything. And to be fair, this is really a more practical way of going to the moon and coming back again. It's efficient. The shuttle had loads of problems with it. Many of it was engineering issues brought about by the fact we just didn't have the technology to design a winged spacecraft just in that nature. And the budgets were cut back heavily, and therefore it was never fully what we wanted. So to go back to the moon, we're just going back to a system that we know is a practical engineering design, only with modern technology. And that's what makes this superior, is the modern technology for it. NASA, of course, most of the rocket isn't reusable. The Orion capsule at the top is reusable, but the actual main rocket isn't. And this is where the private sector, with people like Elon Musk, have slowly overtaken on technical designs because their vehicles are fully reusable. So you almost have a two-tier system going on at the moment to the moon. The NASA one, which is using, if you like, a technology based on the shuttle, using an Apollo-style system, and of course a very modern, very different style, of course, being almost a 1950s concept being used by Elon Musk.
Andy, I think it's we're going to try again on Friday, aren't we? And I'm sure we'll be talking to you then. But for now, thanks very much indeed, Andy Lound, joining us there. Tim Montgomery's alongside me. It feels like a bit of a parable, as Andy tells it, between Elon Musk and I know people love to hate Musk. I think he's fantastic. But the private sector approach to space and NASA spending its taxpayer-funded billions in America.
You said you were depressed by some of that conversation, but I think you were quite enjoying yourself with that. If you had a little model there with your Airfix and all the rest, I think you would have been irrelevant. But you're absolutely right. And I think the private sector is actually teaching NASA quite a few lessons. I don't think we should be too binary about the division between the public sector and the private sector. A lot of private sector research and exploration has benefited hugely from public investment over the years. But definitely the combination of the two sectors is showing that the private sector can bring some agility to this debate.
Tim, thanks very much indeed. Much more news coming up. Do stay with us.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hi there, welcome to Brazier. Coming up live at 5, a green legacy as Boris Johnson urges his successor to continue to pursue net zero despite households seeing their energy bills soar. Is the outgoing Prime Minister right to push his 2050 legal target as he hands over the keys to number 10? Actually, he'll get somebody else to hand over the keys, but you know what I mean, metaphorically. Also, the first Chief Constable to arm all his officers with tasers has called for all forces in the country to do the same. He is Nick Adderley, pictured there. He says it could be a life-saving piece of equipment for police, should every officer be similarly equipped. Kevin Hurley will take a view. And reports suggesting Harry and Meghan could snub going to see the Queen when they visit the UK next month. It's over a security row, apparently. The royal biographer, Angela Levin, will have her say before 6 o'clock. And with me for the next hour, senior GB News contributor and former Boris Johnson advisor, Tim Montgomery. But first, the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. Just after 5 o'clock, the top stories this hour. NASA has postponed the launch of its new moon rocket over an issue with one of its engines. The uncrewed rocket is the world's most powerful to date and was due to propel a test capsule called Orion far from the Earth into the moon's orbit. Engineers, though, say an engine bleed that couldn't be remedied was the cause of the launch being called off today. They added the first opportunity for the next launch attempt will be this Friday, depending on how the engine problem develops. The Artemis 1 mission is aiming to prove people can go to the moon for longer and more sustainably than ever before. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson emphasised the need for safety checks.
It's just illustrative that this is a very complicated machine, a very complicated system, and all those things have to work. And you don't want to light the candle until it's ready to go.
Here in the final week of campaigning in the Conservative leadership contest, Liz Truss's team says she favours targeted support to ease the cost of living crisis. However, the Tory leadership candidate says she's not ruling anything out. She also says it wouldn't be right to announce her entire plan before she has seen analysis from Whitehall. Global Chief Executive of market research company Ipsos, Ben Page, says the Foreign Secretary is under pressure.
Public now wants to see more action and more spending. She's slightly against the grain of the things that she says she stands for, but she's probably going to be forced to do it when she turns her attention from the small number of people who are, of course, choosing the leader of the Conservative Party to the electorate as a whole.
Environment Minister and Team Rishi supporter Victoria Prentice told us, though, the former Chancellor believes help should go to those who need it most.
Rishi's plan is very much to target that help at the most vulnerable households. So, for example, pensioner households or people with disabilities or households on the lowest incomes. And I think that's the right way to go. I know this is hard for everybody, but for some people it's really hard, and we need to help them get through it.
Residents living near Europe's biggest nuclear facility in Ukraine are being given iodine tablets amid fears of a nuclear incident. Authorities handed out the medication to parents and children living close to the Zaporizhzhia power station amid intense fighting in the region. That's as a team from the International Atomic Energy Agency got on its way to investigate a Russian-occupied facility, saying the safety and security of the project must be protected. The Prince of Wales is due to make a donation to the aid charity Islamic Relief to help those affected by the floods in Pakistan. It follows a message from Her Majesty the Queen to the President of Pakistan saying she's deeply saddened by the tragic loss of life and destruction in his country. Pakistan is appealing now for international support as more than 1,000 people have already lost their lives. Unusually heavy monsoon rains have caused flooding in both the north and the south of the country, destroying farmland, crops and impacting more than 30 million people across the country. The Foreign Minister in Pakistan is requesting financial aid now from the United Nations member states.
They're absolutely devastating. I haven't seen any destruction or devastation of this scale. I find it very difficult to put into words the phraseologies that we're used to, whether it's monsoon rains or flooding, doesn't quite seem to encapsulate the ongoing devastation and disaster that we're still witnessing.
Britain's biggest warship is limping back to shore following a mechanical issue. HMS Prince of Wales left Portsmouth on Saturday to spend the next 3 months working with US military partners in the Atlantic. The carrier is now moving slowly from the Isle of Wight towards Gosport, where it's understood the sheltered area will make it easier for divers to examine the extent of the damage. A new offer has been made to Scottish refuse collectors in a bid to halt ongoing strike action. Staff in Edinburgh and a number of other local administrations across Scotland have been staging industrial action over the last week in a dispute over pay. The capital, though, has seen rubbish piling up on the streets during the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. Details of the latest offer haven't yet been made public. And the government has confirmed Gibraltar's status as a city more than 180 years after it was first bestowed by Queen Victoria. The title was originally awarded in 1842, but it was left off the official register of recognised cities. Now, a newly published record confirms Gibraltar's inclusion as a city. Prime Minister Boris Johnson describes the decision as a huge accolade to the area's rich history and dynamism. That's it from GB News. As far as the headlines is concerned, more news as it happens. But now let's get more from Brazier.
Seven minutes past 5. Thanks for your company. We'll start with this one. The outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson this week will urge Britain not to give up on net zero. In a farewell message, he'll say the UK can pursue the policy despite suggestions from many of his own MPs that it's contributed to skyrocketing energy bills and a lack of energy security such that even come this winter, we can't guarantee that the lights will stay on. Well, Liz Truss, the bookies' favourite to be the next Prime Minister, said she would suspend green levies on energy bills and insists that the government's 2050 net zero target mustn't, quote, harm businesses or consumers. Laurie Leyburn is an economist with strong views on net zero. Welcome to you, Laurie. Can we just, I mentioned there Liz Truss saying maybe we can unpick the commitment to 2050 net zero, but I mean, surely the whole point is since Theresa May enshrined it in law, we are legally bound. I mean, personally, I think that tying the hands of successive governments is always a bad idea, but since Theresa May, we are legally bound to hit that target.
Yeah, that's correct. And one of the reasons why we are legally bound is to make sure there is this longer term direction of travel. And that's really important for the businesses and other enterprises that invest in our energy system, to make sure they've got an idea of the longer term course that we need to go in. Because right now we're suffering under a situation where we didn't think enough longer term about how our dependence on things like gas or a lack of insulation in our homes could make us more vulnerable to the kind of situation that we're in now. So it's good to have these longer term things. I mean, I generally agree with you that sometimes they can be difficult for tying the hands of governments into the future, but they're so important for setting a longer term direction for businesses and others who invest in the things that we need, like energy.
A lot of those businesses are already getting it right, you could argue, couldn't you? I mean, 2001, that was the year when we used most energy in this country. It was 30% more than we now use. So, given that, do we need some of the measures, whether it's on boilers or banning diesel engines by 2030? Do we need some of those, what some people see as pretty draconian measures anyway?
Look, the key thing you've got to have in our minds at the moment is that the reason why we're suffering under this huge cost of living crisis with the price of energy spiking is because of the situation with gas. Now, there are basically two reasons why gas is so expensive at the moment. One is the bounce back of economies after COVID and the need for a lot of gas around the world as certain parts of the world have opened up and so on. And the second is Putin's war in Ukraine. And what that means is the price of gas has shot up. And the most expensive thing that's providing our energy then determines the kind of prices that we get as consumers. And so we're in a situation where we're suffering from high prices that, as we know, are going to get much higher as we head through the winter because of our dependence on energy that is determined by the price of fossil fuels. So the more stuff we do to use less energy, so we save money, and also to get our energy from non-fossil fuel sources will mean that we decouple our dependence on those very expensive markets.
Laurie,
and that's the key thing to do. So all of the things we consider have to have that in mind.
I mean, there'll be people saying, well, that's we get all that, but we also get the necessity of making sure you've got a subtle energy mix so that when the gas is incredibly expensive, you can fall back to some degree on nuclear, and you shouldn't be blowing up old coal, blowing up, for heaven's sake, old coal-fired power stations. I mean, of course, we don't want them necessarily. Most people don't want them, but in a time of crisis, they serve a purpose.
Yeah, and all governments around the world right now are looking at a mix of energy sources in this moment of immediate crisis. And over the course of the winter, you'll see all sorts of different sources being used, some heavy, polluting fossil fuel sources like coal and being used. The question is that over the coming years, this situation is probably not going to disappear where we're getting these kind of high prices. And so we've got to go for broke to invest in the kind of energy system that makes sure we are strategically secure, that we are no longer in a situation where we're in hock to what Putin is doing. Because if these kind of events continue to happen and we continue to be dependent on the high price of fossil fuels like we are right now, that's the primary cause of what we're experiencing at the moment, then we're in serious trouble. It will need more investment to decouple us from that situation. And also insulating buildings, win-win. We'll use less energy anyway. We'll be warmer in the winter.
Laurie, just on insulating buildings, I mean, I want to grapple with a particularly thorny nettle. And it seems to be very bad manners at the moment to, and I'll invite a response from you because you clearly care passionately about this. If we're talking about energy prices rocketing, and people really have to start thinking very hard about rationing. I mean, this is not to in any way advocate changes that will see people suffer. Or, old people die in the cold. I mean, clearly support's needed there. But we all know people, you know people, I know people whose lives are spent living in homes where the thermostat is on way higher than it need be. So on an individual basis, can we see some rationing choices made that you would approve of? And why aren't more environmentalists coming forward and saying, actually, stop lamenting £5,000 a year on energy bills, because actually that is the impetus that's required to really change behaviour.
I think so I get what you're saying, I get the logic, and yes, I do think there's a lot that could be done to change people's individual use to make it more efficient so we're not wasting as much energy. I mean, sure, there's loads of that stuff, and I agree. I think that the government should provide us with some leadership that's missing at the moment and stand up and say, we have a plan for this winter. It's going to involve giving you some money to help with your bills, the people who particularly need it, and at the scale that's needed, which is probably something along the lines of what we saw in COVID in the scale of financial support to help people. We've also got this more medium-term plan to help insulate homes and to deal with this structurally, to make the strategic investments. But in return, here are a list of things that we would ask people to do to help cut some of their energy use. And that list has already been disseminated by governments, say, in Europe, like France and so on. But we have to be careful because a lot of people, as you're inferring there, are going to be pushed into a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, no, and I acknowledge that. Just before we invite the Twitter mob to come banging on my door, I made that very clear as well. Laurie, thanks very much indeed. Laurie Layburn. Tim Montgomery's alongside me. Tim, I don't want to labour the point because, as Laurie says, and anybody else on, any right-thinking person on Twitter would say the same thing. People are going to suffer because of £5,000 a year energy bills this winter, obviously, and maybe for the next 2 or 3 winters to come, and it will lead to deaths amongst old people. It's awful, and targeted help is required. But my broad point, actually, is that sometimes when individuals are making rationing decisions, it could be a spur to changes in behaviour which are not necessarily in and of themselves bad.
No, and you could argue, I'm not sure I would just at the moment, but you could argue that the short-term costs that people are going to have to incur this winter might lead them to insulate their homes and make changes that actually will save the money in the years ahead. But the question I think I would have asked Laurie, and I don't know what his answer would have been to this, is one of the things, big differences between, for example, Boris Johnson and the Green Party on net zero, is that Boris Johnson is willing to consider fracking and also advance nuclear power. And the key, I think, to keeping prices low over the long term is to have a diverse energy supply. And I think the Greens' opposition to nuclear power in particular and to fracking means that Britain is more vulnerable in the years ahead if we follow their prescriptions.
Tim. It's almost religious, and I'm not a great fan of George Monbiot, but I remember when George Monbiot, the environmentalist, came out and said, actually, I've been thinking really hard about it, and I think for the environment's sake, we ought to embrace nuclear, and the heavens crashed down upon him.
It's one of my favourite things that happens in public life, is when someone like him admits error. I've got things wrong as well. I'm sure even you have got things occasionally wrong, Colin, but we need more of that in public life, where when the facts change, as they say, people's opinions change.
John Maynard Keynes said
Absolutely.
That. Yeah. Tim, thanks very much indeed. We're going to move on to this story. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, has claimed he did his own research to help block plans for a Christmas COVID lockdown. He said he made spreadsheets based on international data showing the variant was milder than others and presented his findings at colleagues to counter sage scientist plans for a UK circuit breaker. He's become the latest senior Conservative politician to distance himself from the policy after Rishi Sunak last week claimed his warnings of the harms of lockdown were ignored in government meetings during the pandemic. Alan Miller is co-founder of the Together Declaration, who joins me here in the studio, I'm pleased to say. Alan, it's nice to see you.
Good to see you.
I came back last night having travelled all day from Scotland, and therefore I hadn't seen, it was the first time I'd seen the extraordinary front cover story in The Spectator, which was the interview given by Rishi Sunak to Fraser Nelson, the editor of the magazine. And if people haven't read it, I recommend they try and get hold of a copy. It's an extraordinary admission that somebody at the heart of government was saying, stop this lockdown madness, or at least factor in some of the repercussions, and how he was ignored.
Well, it's too little too late, though, isn't it? Because I think that one of the things is one might do something internally, and there was a lot of very worrying points made about edited minutes and meetings and facts not being there. But if you have a principle and if you're committed to the best situation for the country, not just for a particular party, then I think you have a commitment in public service to come out and say it then. It's easy to say something down the road when it becomes apparent and abundantly clear that the costs of lockdown crisis, 7 million waiting on the NHS, the array of damages, the GCSE results, and all of the things that were warned about, the damages. It's easy to say that when you're in a battle to win an election, but where were you at the time? And I think similarly...
Tim, do you remember, was there a single resignation on principle during lockdown from somebody in government who said, this is mad, I can't be part of this?
I don't think there was, and I'm very sympathetic to what Alan says, really, and I think it was John McTernan, the Labour commentator, who said, this guy, Rishi Sunak, he wasn't, junior minister for widgets, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he's standing at the moment to be Prime Minister. If he couldn't impose his will in some way on government during that. If he really was as anti-lockdown as he now suggests he was in that Spectator article, there should have been a change of course, particularly as the second and third lockdowns happened, and his failure, I found it unconvincing, actually, his anti-lockdown.
Well, to be fair, Alan, it's not just Rishi Sunak, is it? Grant Shapps, we're just saying, is saying much the same thing, that Sage was getting away unchallenged with writing government policy.
Well, I think the first thing we need to say is that there was far too much outsourcing of responsibility. It's a problem in Britain, it's a problem internationally. Elected representatives don't like to be accountable anymore to the people that elect them, and instead they tend to outsource things. And we saw that in a really significant way in the listening, elevating Sage to an almost deistical position, and then not making the decisions. You see, these comments that were really damaging to science and freedom, like we're following science, are really reprehensible because, science is a method of inquiry, but policy decisions, what you do about any advice is key. And that outsourcing and us being told all these things by Mr. Vallance and Mr. Whitty, who, by the way, now we'd probably like to, have a little bit of a reckoning and we can't seem to hear from them at all. I think it's very problematic. I think the elected representatives must be held accountable. Grant Shapps in that article may well have done the things he said, but he also advocated travel bans, separating vaccinated and unvaccinated. And also he said in there something very telling. He said, we didn't have a plan at the start. That's utterly untrue because the pandemic strategy, which was very, very significant, had been developed over many years, was there, and it was jettisoned. And one of the concerns is that people have become so distrustful of anything now that if you really want to rally people to do something effective, it's going to be very difficult because, we employed something that has never been done before. There were warnings about the terrible implications and the consequences. They were done, we were run roughshod. And we have both a problem at the level of what it means for freedom and this attempt to nudge and coerce us into things as we go down the line. And, the Together Declaration, we're saying no more. We've got a couple of campaigns about that at the moment.
Well, just on that, OK, there's a retrospective element to all this. Whether the Chief Scientific and Chief Medical Officer want to appear before public inquiry, they probably will, right? But that's all rear-view stuff. Rear-view mirror stuff. There is a question about the future lockdowns. Tony Blair should be approaching the autumn with mandatory mask wearing on public transport. These aren't yesterday's battles, they're tomorrow's battles too.
Absolutely. We've already seen people like the NHS Confederation saying maybe we should mask inside. We've seen that in the NHS, they've retained some of those things. These measures that now have no scientific foundation, right? They're attempts to look like you're doing something. Let's look like we're doing something, rather than the efficacy of actually thinking sensibly how you treat any particular situation. I'm very concerned with this idea that the public are to be suffocated, silenced, nudged, treated with contempt. Where's the open debate? We need a full cost-benefit analysis before we make any decisions that are very significant. Public scrutiny, parliamentary debate, not whipping MPs 5 minutes before a vote or any of that kind of stuff. We still also have legislation in the Public Health Act that means you can implement lockdowns. I think all of these things need to be addressed. But obviously, people today are very concerned about the cost of lockdown crisis, the NHS, and as you say, it's coming down the line. That's why we've got two big campaigns, Axe the Tax and What's the Plan? And we've invited Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak to respond to them.
And people can see details of that online, I'm sure they can. And just to make a point in the interest of balance, I know I interviewed Professor Pankania from Exeter University last week, who said actually there are benefits to wearing masks, but, that's moot, isn't it? Tim Montgomery, final thoughts. The Rishi Sunak interview was, an extraordinary confessional interview. It deserved more attention.
It was, but here's my prediction. In 5 years' time, no senior politician will be defending lockdown. I think the costs of lockdown are going to be so severe. I agree with every word that you've said. 5 years' time, whether it's mental health, failure to diagnose cancer, economic effects, and I think Rishi Sunak is just getting in early, whether fairly or not.
OK. Alan Miller, thanks for coming in. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. We're moving on. We're going to move on to this story. Well, the first hour, we were talking about Boris Johnson's legacy as he approaches his last day as PM. It's a story that's consistently got you writing in great numbers, and so it is today. Julia says, Boris will be a villain. He listened to his wife and not the British people. That's an assertion. We can't prove that. I'm not sure anybody can prove that. How could anyone have wasted such a high majority other than him? Shame on him. Steve says, I think Boris Johnson has morphed into a robotic version of a politician. Says the same things no one is listening to. Louise says, Boris will be remembered as a hero purely because of Brexit. It would never have happened without him. Keep them coming in. We'll try and get as many away as we possibly can. Coming up, the first Chief Constable to arm all his officers with tasers has called for each and every force in the country to do the same. This is Nick Adderley, who says it could be a life-saving piece of equipment for officers across the land, should other forces do what Northamptonshire Constabulary have now done. After the break.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GBNews.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Many of you getting in touch with your thoughts on what Tim Montgomery had to say in his Speaker's Corner today. He was focusing on the BBC and to what extent they are or are not accountable for what they say and do. Barry says, I agree with every word. He quite elegantly said, more guests like him, please. The BBC are a lost cause. Marion says the BBC is funded by the licence payers. Anything that's not providing a service to those licence payers should be axed. So much wasted spend. And Derek says, I stopped watching the BBC a couple of years ago. We should scrap the licence fee, especially as they are so focused on diversity. The first Chief Constable to arm all his officers with tasers is calling on other forces to do likewise. This is the story of Nick Adderley from Northamptonshire Police, says the 50,000-volt stun guns can be a lifesaver for officers working on Britain's streets, claiming he would be, as he put it, bordering on neglectful if he'd not handed it, or these tasers, to members of his force. The former Detective Chief Superintendent of the Metropolitan Police and a recent contender to be the Commissioner, Chief Constable, Commissioner, forgive me, Kevin Hurley, joins us here in the studio, I'm pleased to say. Kevin, thanks for coming in, appreciate it. Tasers, a matter of choice or obligation?
Well, I think it should be a matter of obligation for police officers to carry them. But there are two things we need to establish when we talk about taser. First, the role of the police is to protect us, the public, and if they're not properly equipped, they can't do that. And the second thing that people do not understand about taser is it is the least injurious way of overpowering someone or applying force to someone who doesn't want to comply.
Even though you'll get people who will say, as our last guest an hour ago, former similar rank to you at the Metropolitan Police, Shapton Chowdhury, said the problem is sometimes people die when a taser's discharged.
Well, I won't comment on Shapton, leave it where she is, but I can tell you now that many more people die through the use of force, through people either being battened, choked even, kicked or punched, historically, one ever would do with taser. I'm afraid Chapman likes to play to the audience a little bit, perhaps the woke end of the audience. The bottom line on it is, if you're tased, you get a short, low amperage, and that's the thing that does the harm to anyone, a low amperage shock. Destabilises you for 5 seconds and it's all over. The alternative is to be punched, kicked, hit with a metal button, sprayed with pepper that goes on for a long time, or 5 seconds and it's finished and you're in custody.
Tim was wincing slightly, which reminds me of the fact that we expect so much of our police officers, don't we, to deal with situations which they face day in, day out, and the rest of us maybe face once or twice in a lifetime. Tough job, they deserve the support they need.
Oh, absolutely. A friend of mine has just become a special, and the stories he tells of the risks that police take on our behalf, again and again. So much is about domestic violence.
Absolutely.
Confronting really volatile situations. And I think if I was a police officer, I would hope that I'd be properly trained, and that's the key responsibility to police, in conflict resolution and calming a situation down.
Absolutely.
But I would absolutely want, not just for my own protection, I think, but for the protection of the people potentially in that domestic violence or other situation, I'd want something here, a taser, that would be able to be used in a last resort.
Shabnam Chowdhury makes the point that it ought to be a matter of choice. The problem with choice is that if too few people on a given force elect to have one, then it stops serving any purpose.
Well, Shabnam doesn't really understand the dynamics of street fighting, to be quite honest with you. I've been in many, many street fights and I've hurt a lot of people and I've put some in hospital. If I'd had a taser, that wouldn't have happened to them. It would have all been over. And the reason why it shouldn't be a matter of choice is the role of the police is to confront people who are wrongdoers or violent or a threat to the public and protect the public. You need that extra tool to do precisely that. They're far more effective, providing that they strike, in stopping someone immediately than hitting someone repeatedly with a metal baton.
I'm going to spool back, if I can, to find the exact quote from... there he goes. Bordering on neglectful if he'd not handed out to his team tasers, said Nick Adderley. I get the sense that he feels it's more lawless out there than it has been. Is it?
My sense of it is, and I say that having 3 immediate members of my family in the Metropolitan Police and engaging with not only them but other people socially quite often, there's no doubt of that. If you look at the incivilities, the stuff you're seeing on social media, where it's seen as de rigueur for young people now to try and free people being taken into custody by police, it's a major problem. And the police are not quite like they were in terms of their size, their mix, even the way in which they're trained at dealing with these issues on the street.
Their fitness?
Well, the fitness standards are fairly low, if I'm honest. But one of the things that's missing in initial police training now is when you first joined, you used to have to go in a boxing ring with one of your other students so that you actually had the opportunity, frankly, to be punched in the face. And then you also had to go in the wrestling ring with them, so you had the opportunity of being thrown through the air and bounce on the floor. A lot of people who join the police have never experienced that, so it comes as a big shock first time round. And even for me, I was a wrestler and a boxer before I joined. Street confrontation is a big shock until you've dealt with it. It's very different to the ring, but the training does not build that in where people expect that and deal with it.
Kevin, let me bring that back then to tasers. If you've got people who don't much, if I can paraphrase what you just said, don't much want to mix it, for whatever the reason is, and they're confronted by somebody who, these people have always existed, want to beat the 7 bells out of a police officer, and now you're not entirely sure whether they might be looking to stab you as well. Might that all lead you to conclude that the police officers armed with tasers are going to be that bit more likely to deploy them rather than getting stuck in?
Well, I think, actually, if there's someone who's not prepared to deal with confrontation and initially, as you said, negotiate, dominate by voice, they're more likely to have the taser taken off them and used on them by the other person, because a street fight is all about dominating someone, going in hard and fast. And if you're someone going, oh, taser, taser, next thing they're on you and it's taken off you. So, you know, a person can cross a gap within fractions of a second and overpower the other person. I think there's an issue about police officers having additional training to both deal with the confrontation, if you like, reduce the conflict, but also on how to be robust and actually do a bit of street fighting. They call it officer safety. It is not. It's street fighting that you need to teach.
There's no getting away from it. A friend of mine who served as a police officer said you generally look to get filled in a couple of times in your first 2 years of your probationary period. And it's an awful reality, but it's the reality.
If you're someone who's prepared to do stop and search and get involved in confrontation, there's a very good chance that you could, as you put it, get filled in or assaulted. I, a couple of times, once kicked unconscious on the tube not far from here, trying to arrest a street robber, and another time broke my hand trying to arrest someone who was a deserter from the Belgian paratroops, as all things.
That's brave.
Yeah, well, I was a paratrooper myself before,
Right.
so the British paras beat the Belgians because we won that day. However, there's quite a lot of the difficult situations you can end up in if you're prepared to go out there and confront wrongdoing.
Kevin and Hurley, as ever, appreciate you coming in and providing us with your insights. Thanks very much indeed. Coming up, there was almost liftoff for a new era of space exploration and the journey to send people back to the moon today. NASA cancelled the planned launch of Artemis 1 because of technical problems. The mission, a test run for future attempts to send folk back to the moon, will now lift off on Friday. We'll speak to Philippe Delou, manager of the Orion European Service Module Programme, about that next. First, the latest news headlines with Polly.
The headlines: NASA has postponed the launch of its new moon rocket over an issue with one of the engines. The unmanned rocket is the world's most powerful to date and was due to propel a test capsule far from the Earth into the moon's orbit. Engineers say there was a problem with the engine that couldn't be remedied and they've called it off. The first opportunity to try again will be in September, on the 2nd of September, depending on how that engine problem develops. The Artemis 1 mission is aiming to prove people can go to the moon for longer and more sustainably than ever before. Residents living near Europe's biggest nuclear facility in Ukraine are being given iodine tablets amid fears of a nuclear incident. The authorities handed out the medication to parents and children living close to the Zaporizhzhia power station amid intense fighting. That's as a team from the International Atomic Energy Agency went on its way to investigate a Russian-occupied facility in the country, saying safety and security must be protected. The Prince of Wales is due to make a donation to the aid charity Islamic Relief to help those affected by the floods in Pakistan. It follows a message from Her Majesty the Queen to the President of Pakistan, saying how deeply saddened she is by the tragic loss of life and destruction due to flooding across the country. It follows an appeal by Pakistan for international support, as more than 1,000 people so far have lost their lives in the flooding. Unusually heavy monsoon rains have caused flooding in both the north and the south of the country, destroying farmland and impacting more than 30 million people. The family of a 16-year-old boy who died at Leeds Festival have paid tribute to their beautiful and fiercely independent son. David Salino fell ill whilst at the music event and died yesterday, despite the efforts of paramedics to save him. West Yorkshire Police is investigating whether the teenager had taken ecstasy before his death. You're up to date on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News. Time to go back to Brazier in a second.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Some money news for you. The pound against the dollar trading at 1.173. The pound against the euro trading at 1.172. And if you'd like to buy an ounce of gold, you'll have to fork out £1,485.76.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News, investments that matter.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
We'll just skip through some of your emails, many of which have been coming in on high energy prices. Boris Johnson's commitment to net zero. Colin says, this is ridiculous. I've camped in minus 15-degree temperatures. We don't need heating. It's purely a luxury. The human race managed to survive for thousands of years without central heating. Time to man up, people. Peter says, I'm a pensioner. I'm not entitled to any handouts and already use as little fuel as possible. Even last year, I struggled to pay my energy bills. Using less isn't the answer for me. Cheaper energy is my only solution. Remove all green taxes, remove VAT, let's trust might. That was my intervention, not the correspondence. And reduce the government fuel duty, since the government benefits from high prices and the rise in revenue. Now, technical problems scuppered NASA's launch of the first rocket in its Artemis project, which aims to send astronauts back to the moon. NASA's most powerful rocket, known rather prosaically as the Space Launch System, was set to send the unmanned capsule Orion around the back of the moon. The launch, however, postponed until at least Friday. Engineers didn't quite manage to fix what we're told was an engine bleed. We're joined by Philippe Delou, the manager of the Orion European Service Module Programme. He's been at the launch site at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida today, which I suppose turned out to be, Philippe, an anticlimax, but something which ought to be, we hope, maybe come Friday resolved.
Yes, we hope. I mean, it's in the hands of NASA. Yes, it's a deception for us. We were we were hoping to see our system flying, but unfortunately the RS-25 engine, which are engines inherited from the shuttle and proven to be reliable, for some reason had a technical problem with the bleed, as you said. One of the engine didn't bleed, and therefore the cooling of the thrust vector control of the engine was not functional.
Philippe, there'll be some of our viewers and listeners surprised to know that there is a big European involvement in this NASA programme. It's a reminder, I suppose, that space exploration is hugely costly, at least when it's done by the public sector in this instance, and that collaboration like this has been going on for years.
That is correct. We have built up collaboration with NASA for a very, very long time. And this collaboration has developed further with the International Space Station, where Europe built the automated transfer vehicle, which was a cargo resupplying the space station with fuel and cargo for the crew. And we demonstrated there the quality of the European technology, and we demonstrated to NASA that we could be very reliable partners. That's the reason why about 10 years ago, we got together to discuss the possibility of us participating to the Orion crew vehicle and providing the service module, which is effectively the powerhouse of the Orion vehicle.
Philippe, it's possible to look at the way this rocket looks with the escape rocket and the Orion module and your service module, and to see a rocket which, in terms of the engineering principles behind it, is not all that terribly different from the Saturn V rockets of more than 50 years ago. Explain to us, if you can, why actually looks are deceptive, and this is a much more advanced piece of equipment.
Well, I can't talk too much about the rocket, the SLS rocket, because I'm not part of it. It's different for many reasons. Let's say the vehicle, and I'm going to talk about the Orion vehicle, which I know much better. The Orion vehicle is significantly different than the Apollo crew module, because we want to have a sustainable exploration, and we want to be able to stay longer in space with the Orion vehicle. For instance, there is a plan to have a station in the moon vicinity called the Gateway, and the Orion vehicle will have to dock to this gateway and stay there dock for a number of weeks or months, which was a requirement which didn't exist at the time of Apollo. Apollo had a very fixed mission, going to the moon, land on the moon, stay there a few days, couple of days, and then go back. So it was a total of a couple of weeks mission where the astronauts were, let's say, surviving based on what they brought from Earth. In Orion, we try to use as much as we can with what we have in space, for example, for solar rays, providing electricity.
It actually is a very different spacecraft in reality. Philippe Delou, thanks so much for your time. Do appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Very different kind of story. Could there be a snub in the making after reports that Prince Harry and Meghan won't visit the Queen in Balmoral next month when they visit the UK? The pair, last seen in Balmoral in 2018, still apparently waiting for a decision on whether or not the Met Police will provide their security during their visit. A Home Office panel will have the final say. Prince Harry last saw his grandmother during her Platinum Jubilee, where she was able to meet her great-granddaughter, named Lilibet, for the first time. We're joined by the royal biographer, Angela Levin, who's here in the studio. Angela, welcome to you.
Hello.
We didn't mention that introduction, well, you ought to have done, this interview that Meghan's done with The Cut.
Yes.
Which I suspect you've got views on.
Yes, it's breathtaking, her arrogance and her rudeness and her taking everything for granted and not giving anything back attitude. I think it's too shocking. I thought what she looked like was not at all attractive. It was all angry and powerful and don't do anything to me, otherwise you will suffer sort of look. And I think it's a tragedy that she has convinced Harry that his family is so awful. I mean, when you mentioned they saw the Queen during the Jubilee, it was only for 15 minutes because she was extremely busy. It was put another load onto her and completely unnecessary. They could have come another time. And now to say they won't go up and see her is spiteful, in my view, because it's not dangerous up there. There's nothing to see for miles, so he doesn't need protection 24/7, but because he's fighting. I mean, I think it's Camilla, really, that she has to win, and she will fight on to the end. Some people might admire that, and in some situations, it's absolutely ideal, but I don't think you do that with family. And I think that the whole thing of sort of, are you coming, aren't you coming, make up your mind, and then to decide not to. When she's 96, we hear that she's got problems and she's got to rest more. We don't know how long she's got.
Well, on this, Angela, we're going to tread very sensitively on this, obviously, but I just wonder whether, to what extent you feel that actually a visit would be practical, given the Queen's current condition. And I'll draw our viewers and listeners' attention to your tweet yesterday, because it really caught my ear. You said one of your sources had said there'd been a change in the past few weeks in the Queen's mobility, which meant that she was, and you put this in quotes, resting a lot more. You described this as a very worrying development.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm saying these things because I'm sort of hot under the collar, but I do believe that if the Queen was so ill that she didn't want them, then they shouldn't go. But there's still talk about going to the Games. She's not pulled out of that yet, and she's still having quite a few visitors like William and Catherine and the children. And if children go, that's quite tiring. But I think she wants the family, and that can boost her. She does love Harry, and if he could pop in for 10 minutes, I think it's worth his while flying there to do so if she wants him. If she doesn't, then I think maybe he's right and I'm completely wrong. But I sense that it's not quite like that.
Tim?
Well, I think you're right to say how important it is to tread carefully around this topic at the moment, Colin. But I think it wasn't insignificant that we learnt in the last few days that when the new Prime Minister enters office next week, there won't be the normal. Remember, we always see the motorcade going from Downing Street to the Buckingham Palace. I don't know whether a seal has to be handed over and whether that will still happen in some way. But the fact that the Queen she takes her duties towards the Prime Minister so seriously. The fact that she has to stay in Balmoral, all I would say is I'm praying for the Queen and the whole royal family at the moment, and I hope she reigns over us for a long time. But some of this news isn't encouraging.
OK, Tim, Angela, thanks both very much indeed. Mountains of rubbish line the streets of Edinburgh after a fortnight without bin collections. Scotland's waste and cleaning workers walked out on the 18th of August in a dispute over pay. They're due to return to work tomorrow. Residents and business owners facing a huge backlog to their waste collections. It's been a problem in Glasgow as well and elsewhere in parts of Scotland. But today it's been revealed the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, hasn't necessarily faced these same problems after the Scottish Government hired a private firm to remove waste from her official residence using taxpayers' funds. Nilesh Ravel is the owner of Victoria Regalia and has, we're told, stacks of rubbish outside his shop, which can't be much fun for him nor his customers. Nilesh, welcome to you. Just give us a geography lesson. Whereabouts are you?
We are just on the bottom of the castle in Edinburgh. And we find that a lot of rubbish has been left out by the people living around, and also not having collections on a regular basis makes it quite worse, which you must have seen it this morning on your programme.
I mean, presumably, it can't be very appealing for customers having to, I was going to say wade through this stuff. It's obviously not that bad. I don't know, how bad is it?
Well, it's quite bad. I mean, if you want, I can show you the video now. There's a lot of bags, but I can also understand the reason why they're striking. I mean, this is something for the government to sort it out. It should have been sorted out well before it happened. And we were going through the festival time in Edinburgh, and all the tourists in town can see the mess. It should have been sorted out by the government.
I'm just reading, Nilesh, the latest story from our friends at the Press Association that tell us, this was literally 20 minutes ago, that the union has rejected the latest offer from local authorities in Scotland to secure a pay deal and a settlement to this problem. What do you make of reports that Nicola Sturgeon doesn't face the problems that other people in Edinburgh are facing?
Well, I personally can't comment on government status and government's strength of doing things for their own personal. But we, just as a normal public and business owners who pay these rates regularly, should find our premises outside our premises to be much cleaner.
Yeah. How long, obviously what we don't know is how long this goes on for. As you say, you've had that incredibly busy time over the duration of the festival. At the end of the summer now, numbers of visitors will start to fall off a little bit. But, I mean, there still is a problem that needs fixing.
Yes, it needs to be cleared out as soon as possible.
Nilesh Ravel, thanks so much for your time, and we wish you well, and we hope the rubbish gets cleared away as quickly as possible. Spokesman for the Scottish Government said it was appropriate that Mitty, that's the private firm, collected rubbish from Bute House, government building in Edinburgh, because it, quote, also functions as an office for officials and the cabinet. Just a quick word from Tim Montgomery. That sort of has to be true, doesn't it? I mean, if you can't have your centre of government looking like a tip, no pun intended.
Let's not underestimate, the implications of things like the Edinburgh litter crisis and, Heathrow not functioning at the moment. I've been talking to a London hotelier just the other day, and they're saying that people are beginning to cancel because they don't want the hassle of coming through Heathrow. The same images that must be seen around the world. This is not good for Britain, and tourism's a really important part of our economy.
Yeah, we rely on the service sector, don't we? And tourism's a really big part of that. Tim, for now, thanks very much indeed. Coming up next, it's Jubes & Co. Emily Carver's in the seat today with a view on what's coming up. Emily.
Hello, great show. We're going to be also talking about strikes, but we're going to be talking about whether the government should take a tougher stance when it comes to certain union militancy. We're also going to be having a look at whether energy should be renationalised. That's after that poll by Tory voters that showed they may be in favour of nationalising energy, which would be quite something. And tasers, should police have them?
Emily, thanks very much indeed. It's a question Tim Montgomery and I have been pondering on through the course of this afternoon with two very different perspectives on tasers. Somebody who was taking the view that actually they should be a choice, somebody who took the different view that they ought to be mandatory. Either way, we're a million miles away from Dixon of Dock Green, policing 1950s style the UK, that proud boast that our officers didn't need to be armed. Those days are gone. It's sepia-tinted nostalgia.
It is, but I'm still very glad that we are a country that doesn't have armed police. Actually, if you look at the number of incidents where the police actually discharge their weapons, it's often in single figures each year. So let's not, we have a crime problem. It's clear we have a crime problem in this country at the moment, and I don't think we give the police the support that they deserve. But at the same time, let's not frighten people too much. Actually, compared to a lot of countries in the world, certainly outside of London, we still are a very safe country. We need to be vigilant and we need to give the police more resources, but let's not frighten ourselves.
Tim, thanks very much indeed. Tim Montgomery, if you want to see his monologue about the BBC, I recommend it to you. It's available online. Let's finish with the weather. Looking ahead to this evening's weather picture, the UK is looking largely dry with the best of the late sunshine in the south and west. The details for you. A fine end to the day across southwest England. It's still breezy along the south coast, but dry for all with some brightness ahead of dusk. Temperatures around 21 degrees Celsius. Dry to end the day for much of southeast England and London with sunny spells and a light northeasterly breeze. Temperatures nudging 20 degrees Celsius. Plenty of late evening sunshine ahead of dusk. A gentle northeasterly breeze in prospect. Temperatures across South Wales will sit at a pleasant 21 degrees Celsius. A dry evening to come across the Midlands. Plenty of sunny spells to end the day. Some cloud we think will float through on a light northeasterly wind. Temperatures sat at 19 Celsius. A few glimmers of late evening sunshine across the northeast of England, although it's still rather cloudy. Perhaps the light shower is still possible. A cool northeasterly breeze. Temperatures 16 to 18. Sunny spells and the risk of a few showers for the borders this evening. Soon turning dark, skies remaining clear, winds light and temperatures around 16 degrees Celsius. Fine and dry end to the bank holiday Monday across Northern Ireland. Plenty of sunshine ahead of dusk. The northeasterly breeze will remain light with temperatures around 19 degrees Celsius. Most places dry overnight, perhaps a few showers in the east, chillier than recent temperatures or recent nights with temperatures down to 8 degrees Celsius. That's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.